Alright, so in this video I want to talk about my sort of concept of the 5 main elements that make up drawing, and secondly, how that relates to our need to develop a process to, create images and to create illustrations. So the first thing is, I think there are 5 main elements to drawing, and I think this will sort of just help to clarify certainly my view of this, and hopefully give you a few ideas for how you can break down and troubleshoot your images going forward. And again, the idea here is to clarify why we need process and just what's going on when images go wrong. So the 5 main elements that I think are really key here are, if we go to the next slide, there's the what, how, with, intent, and practice, right? So the what is, what are you drawing? The second is how you represent that thing. The third is what tools you use to do that. Intent is understanding why we're doing this, and there's the need essentially to practice. Okay, so let's go through those and break it down a little bit. So the first thing that I think is the most important, and the first thing to think about with drawing is the what, right? You can't draw what you don't know. And I think undeveloped visual library is, or at least is at the very top of the primary amateur mistake. People are so often sort of getting into a problem with their drawing and just not understanding that the problem is you don't know how to draw that thing. If we don't have a good visual library, you can't sort of draw stuff from imagination. And also, it's not just a matter often of getting reference, right? You actually need to understand and have good knowledge of the thing you're drawing. The example I normally use is you can look at sort of horses or cars, right? And if you think about cars, if I said like, who knows what a car looks like, right? Who would be able to pick a car versus a truck, right? And most people, I think, could be able to do that, right? Like what's the difference between a car and an SUV and a full drive, or you'd be able to sort of pick this out. If I started to sort of get a little bit more specific and say, okay, like who would know, the difference between a sports car and a sedan, right? Most people are going to be like, yeah, I get it. Okay, but once we get more specific, okay, what you'll find is most people, unless you're a car person, are gonna run out of specificity at some point, So I say, well, can you tell the difference between a Lamborghini and a Ferrari, right? Like, without knowing it, if I sort of just showed you like, again and again next to each other, here's like Lamborghini, Ferrari, who would be able to tell you? I mean, I would, right? I kind of know enough about this stuff, and it's not just because, I know some of the Lamborghinis and some of the Ferraris. I mean, I understand the design language that the different companies employ. And if you're into cars, it's really obvious, right? The other thing would be, if you get really into sort of cars, you might say, the question I sort of often ask is like, well, who knows what a Nissan Skyline looks like, right? And in Australia, right, Japanese import cars are like pretty popular. Most people's hands will go up and be like, okay, I know what a Nissan Skyline is, right? If you saw one, you'd be able to be like, okay, yeah, I get it. But if I say like, well, who here would know the difference between, like an R32, an R33, an R34 Skyline, right? Again, most at that point, it's you're looking at 1 or 2% of the human race, or certainly of the people in the class. And then, if you're really lucky, there'll be a car person who understands, like, who knows the difference between, a standard R34 GTR and, maybe like a V-Spec, GTR, right? And at that point, like, visually, the number of people who are going to be able to tell that apart is 0. But if you're drawing like Initial D, or you're drawing one of these mangas that has cars in it, or you're just that's a big part of what you do, you damn well need to know exactly what that is, and people do. And I think that's often what makes up the difference between people who are really good at something and are able to kind of get to that next level with their sort of art, and especially design. This is really, really important if you're interested in the entertainment industry and in design. You need to sort of really understand how things work. But what sort of I've noticed, and this is through experience of sort of running, being sort of close to the running of art schools, and having like a lot of different people come to give masterclasses, right? A lot of really, really talented top talent, like the top names in the world in entertainment industry often come and do masterclasses at the school that I'm a part of. And, you just kind of notice like a lot of these people are really into a specific thing, and you can kind of tell, right? Often the people who are, the monster designers, you go look at their world, and their office is full of animal skulls and lizards and all this kind of weird morbid stuff, and you won't be able to tell it by looking at the person. Often the people are just completely straight-laced, perfectly happy, well-adjusted people, but they just really love monsters, and they are so interested in dead things and skulls and weird undersea creatures and all this creepy stuff. And that is how they become the best in the world at creating monsters, right? It's through that. People are into science fiction, designing science fiction sort of stuff or drawing science fiction stuff, often have a real interest in scientific advancements, and so they're reading the latest kind of news about robotics and artificial intelligence and stuff like that. And it's that extra little bit of knowledge that gives them that sort of extra 1 or 2% of advantage over the rest of the population when it comes to designing the next look of how things will function, right? And often they have a good understanding of how things do function. And that helps them design and draw and do all that stuff. So the other thing is like horses, right? I'm like, who knows the difference between a horse and a cow? Like, yeah, most people, right? Who knows the difference between all the different types of Arabian horses there are, right? It's like, again, it's the same as the GTR Skyline thing, right? Unless you're a horse person, you're probably not going to be able to even tell an Arabian from a whatever. I mean, I'm not a horse person, so I can't even give good things. It's like you might be able to tell the difference between an Arabian horse and a Clydesdale, right? But, you need specificity. But there are a lot of people in the world who know exactly what that is and will be able to tell you. And you show them 100 horses and they'll tell you 100 different names, right? Same for cats, same for dogs, same for all these things. And that's often what is separating your ability to draw something, and certainly your ability to draw something really well from, your ability to kind of just mess it up. So the first thing is what, right? You just cannot draw what you don't know, especially if it's from imagination, but even kind of, you just get reference. It's not necessarily going to help you really be able to draw it or modify it or plus it. It's so important. And this is really just about visual library, developing a visual library and understanding if you're going in there and you're trying to draw something that, you don't know how to do, don't have a good expectation of that working out. And I think often people do. Often people go into these things being like, what's going wrong with my drawing? And it's like, you're trying to draw something you don't know, and that rarely works. So the second thing, if this slide will progress, the second thing is how, right? How do you represent that thing? And this is where your basic artistic skill set, your foundation comes in, okay? So you've got things like perspective, rendering, composition. You need to have the sort of more theoretical, mental sort of building blocks of how pictures are made, right? How do you do shading? How do you understand where your lighting's coming from? This is all of that stuff, right? This is the how. And this is most of what we're actually trying to learn when we're sort of studying art, let's say. And again, this is the reason this is obvious should be obvious, right? The reason that this is important should be very clear. We need to know these things in order to draw. And if your ability, to understand what a Nissan Skyline is really high, but you don't understand perspective, you're not going to be able to draw it, right? You need all of these things working in order to effectively execute a drawing. So the next thing is what tools you're using, right? The with, right? So what are you using to communicate? What tools, what medium, what techniques? And this is really important. And again, it should be obvious, but often I feel like it's not to people because they're trying to do all of these things at once. And it can be very hard to troubleshoot if you're kind of trying to build visual library, build your foundational skill set, and you're sort of not 100% comfortable with your technique. But knowing the tools and the medium is going to be vital to you being able to execute an image well. The best example of this I can give is if you take someone who is a master oil painter and they have good visual library, for what they're trying to create, and they have, impeccable technical ability. They understand shading, rendering, perspective, lighting, everything. But, if they're a good, at one medium, let's say like oil or something like that, and then you immediately say, oh, let's do the same thing, but let's do it with watercolor. If they've never used watercolor before, it doesn't matter how good they are, they're going to have to learn how that tool functions, right? One is light to dark, one's, sort of either medium out or dark to light or whatever. They've got a completely different methodology of roughing in and building an image. And, they will have to adapt, and it'll take them a long time to adapt. It's not just going to be like click. Now, it'll take them, obviously, eventually they'll be able to get good results, and they may be able to get better results than the average person, but it's not like the master skills immediately transfer across medium. Okay, they do transfer, and it's just a matter of that person learning the medium. But until that happens, that person should have no reasonable expectation of being able to just instantly jump in and create amazing, magical stuff. So the next thing, right, I think is really important is a little bit more amorphous. And I'd say those first things, right, sort of what you're drawing, how you're drawing it, and the tools you're drawing it with are really the key things. Those are the main three things. There's these two additional things that I feel like can get lost and can blindside us if we're learning to draw, learning to create illustrations, and we're not really aware that they're a part of the mix. The first is intent, right? What is the purpose of this drawing? Now, that might seem amorphous, but I do feel like I've seen a lot of people really get tripped up because maybe they start an image as, just something a little bit rougher, and then they kind of say, oh, this is going well, I like this, I'll just sort of keep working on it and keep adding detail. And I'll kind of look at it and go like, well, what are you doing, right? You're kind of swapping the intent halfway, and the way that you create a really finished, highly polished illustration is not often by just taking something that was just a sketch and just like directly working it up. You often need to plan where that detail is going to go. And there's a process where if you want to spend 20 hours on an image, right, you probably want to spend a couple of those hours planning and just kind of like taking a sketch that looks good as a sketch and kind of just like keep adding detail often isn't the best solution, right? Unless that is specifically the process that you've been developing and working on. Often it is a matter of like if you want to create a 50-hour drawing or a 100-hour sort of image, there's a much more detailed development process where you basically plan out a detailed image, and you often need to do a lot of work in order to figure out where that detail is going. Otherwise, again, people often just sort of get lost in the middle, and it's sort of, again, the intent is not there. The other thing that I think can really trip up people, especially when they're beginning when it comes to intent, is that you can begin by sort of saying, oh, I'm just going to do this as a study, or I'm just sort of doing compositional studies. But then it kind of the lines between, are you doing a study where you're trying to learn something from this sort of exercise, or are you actually trying to create an image for yourself? And I think this trips up more of the students that I sort of teach, sort of one-on-one in actual sort of physical classroom situations than anything else, right? And it goes like this. We're giving them an exercise that is a technical drawing exercise, and they try and make it interesting, right? They try and add personality to it. And I'm like, that just doesn't work, because you can't make some of these technical drawing exercises that interesting, right? If you're drawing boxes or whatever, it's not about it being creative, right? We've specifically designed that exercise to be boring so that you kind of can't escape and make it look interesting, right? You can't use any tricks to get out of it, right? It either lives or dies on whether or not you get the perspective right, whether you get it looking realistic, So, you might have an exercise that's like, again, let's do compositional studies or whatever. It's like, okay, do that, but just do it for a little bit and then move on. And don't get confused between you doing compositional studies or you sort of doing this particular task that you've been set and then you working on your process, right? it's very easy to kind of, I see people often get this sort of mixed up in sketchbooks as well. People often get sketchbook paralysis because they're like, oh, I don't want to work in my sketchbook because, I'm trying to do this. And it's like, you start off a sketchbook trying to make it all really pretty, and then you sort of get sick of doing that and you want to add some quicker sketches to it. But people are like, oh, no, but this is my, perfect sketchbook that I don't want to make it look bad. And it's like, well, what are you doing, right? Like, what is the purpose here? People often need two sketchbooks, like one for good stuff and one for bad stuff. It's like, is it a sketch or is it a finished thing? Like, what are you doing? Are you trying to create a piece of art that the sketchbook is? It's like, there's no right or wrong to any of this, right? All of these are viable things, but if you get the intent wrong, especially if someone's giving you an exercise or something specifically to do and people feel the need to kind of make it creative or personal, it's just counterproductive, right? You're just spinning wheels, right? You're just spinning tires. No power is going to the ground. You're not spending your time effectively. And again, people do head studies. Let's do Loomis head studies. Let's figure out the sort of structure or whatever. And it's like, okay, do that, but don't then sort of start to mix that with like you actually drawing the things that you want, right? Because you get your wires crossed. It's like, am I doing a study? Am I doing this? Am I being creative? Like, what's happening? The intent is really key. Are you just messing around? Are you just doing some rough warm-up sketches? Just do that, right? Are you practicing something new? If you're practicing something new, then just relax. Don't worry about the outcome. It's just you're just sketching, You're just trying something new. If you're practicing, like, I'm just going to try and put a lot of detail into this image, like, practice that, but realize that may not work. And if it doesn't turn out, that's fine, because it was a practice, right? Versus I'm going to try and create, again, the best image I can right now. And I'm going to put all my energy into making this look awesome. Then you may have to have a completely different process where, again, you don't bite off more than you can chew. You just pick something that's kind of sensible, that you can make good already. So understand what you're doing there. What is the object of this image? How long is it going to take? How much, how does that affect the process? How does that affect your expectation of the result, right? So the intent and your expectation are really key. You need to line those up. What's my intent and what am I expecting to get out of this? When am I expecting this to finish? What level of quality am I expecting? What am I going to consider success or failure, right? Getting that key and clear in your mind is really important. Now, a lot of people just do this naturally, and you may just be like totally fine with this. That's fine, okay? But just notice, like, for that, if this ever does come up for you, just realize it is important to clarify that, right? I've found lots of, personally, I've run into that with studies where I'll be doing, Loomis head studies. That's why I sort of mentioned that. And, I sort of just kept doing them, and I'm like, well, the more I do, the better I get. So I just got to keep doing studies. And it's kind of like, I'd feel like the studies would get worse and worse, and it's because my mind's not really in the right place to do that. And, it's kind of like, I'm not really practicing me drawing faces, and sort of having fun with that and trying to think about the person I'm drawing. I'm just sort of thinking about like, structure. So you got to know why you're doing what you're doing, right? And you got to know when to stop and when to do something else. Hopefully that's simple. Again, let me know if any of this stuff is like not clear. Let me know. I'm more than happy to clarify with follow-up content. So the next thing is the idea of practice, right? And I sometimes, if I'm being more sort of intellectual or flippant, I call this the soma, right? Because I think a really key thing that's core to my teaching when it comes to drawing is the idea of somatic knowledge, right? Which is just body knowledge. And my idea there is that I feel like there is a part of us that does most of the drawing, which is not our sort of our neocortex, right? It's not the thinking, conscious part of us. A lot of it is our muscle memory, it's our physicality, it's our hand-eye coordination, it's our body and our subconscious mind that is actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting. That's the thing that actually draws, right? Your conscious mind sort of says, draw a straight line, and your body and your conscious mind says draw a straight line. Your subconscious mind and your body sort of says, okay, and then it does it, right? And it sort of does all that calculation. It doesn't tell you it's doing it because that's not how we work, right? But the key here is that even if you know sort of what you're drawing, you know how to do it, and you know the tools and the medium, if you kind of are like mixing those things together for the first time, right? Maybe you're adding visual library, but you already have a very good deft control of the medium and your technical ability. If you're building visual library, it will take a while for you to actually get good at something, right? And again, that may be obvious and it may not. Again, I'm bringing these up because I found for everyone kind of is often missing one of these things, right? They're often like, oh, I never realized that was a thing. You know, a lot of people, this may be like, duh, like I get it. And that's fine. Hopefully this is sort of useful. But, you know, I often see a lot of people are just missing this because they just like haven't really thought about this stuff, right? And they get frustrated. The problem here isn't that any of these things are going to be a problem. The problem is like if you're not understanding that this is part of the expectation of how you're going to learn and how things are going to work, it can be very frustrating if you sort of go to draw something and you sort of think like, I thought I should be better at this. Why is this not working? And it's often you won't even need that much practice, but if you immediately try something and it's not working, that you can immediately enter into frustrationville, right, and start to feel negative about what you're doing. And that is where you sort of go out of flow and you stop feeling good about your art, and then everything kind of just sucks after that. So it's so important to just understand that, right? When we are actually firing on all cylinders and when we're sort of in flow, there's not much conscious mind going on. Most of what's happening is muscle memory and a whole bunch of stuff that sort of doesn't make sense. And often it takes a while for this stuff to sync up. And you need to have expectation that that's going to be the case. Okay, so, you know, the next question is like, what can we do to improve these different elements, right? Well, I think, you know, the first thing is really simple, right? The first thing is to recognize that simply attempting to create good images each time we sit down to create, right, with focus and dedication, will help us learn. They'll help us sort of put these things together. The second thing is that bad drawings often equal good learning, right? So I often tell the story of me when I'm sort of talking about this is I tell the story of me trying to draw this like a Kuma drawing, which is part of one of the first courses I taught for CG Society, right, back in sort of, you know, the early 2010s. And this was one of the first times where I'd sort of tried to put a course together and I'd sort of recorded myself doing something. And I'd already recorded myself quite a bit, but this is the first time where I was sort of, I encountered this thing. And what happened is I just sort of thought, oh, as an exercise, let's do a couple of things. One is, I think first week was like, we're going to draw a fantasy sort of armor girl. It's like you can basically pick whatever you want. So one thing that you're making up from your imagination, another thing where you're trying to draw fan art, right? And this is really the first time I'd ever done this, but I just sort of went into it like, what's the big deal? I just got to draw like Akuma from Street Fighter. I like the character. That's sort of one of the characters I play, you know, and I never do much fan art, but I thought, what's the problem? And it's probably like a 40-minute or 1 hour, sort of maybe hour and a half. I forget exactly how long the actual real-time thing was. And you can see it's done in 2012. And I just ran into major trouble because I was recording myself, and it's the first time I'd really been observing myself doing this. And I ran into trouble because I was drawing it, and the problem was it didn't look like Akuma, right? It didn't look like the character I was meant to draw. And I was just sort of sweating bullets because I went into it with expectation that like this would be no problem because I've done this sort of thing a million times. But because I was observing it, right, it felt like, oh my God, like I'm just not immediately connecting all these dots. And I was like, it's just not looking like the character. I'm like, I know I can see the character. There's the reference. What's going wrong? And it felt like, I was sitting there just like scratching around like a complete beginner for like hours, and it was just this huge failure thing. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have to re-record this. Like, what's going on? Maybe I shouldn't be teaching, maybe this is all a bad idea. Like, I want to go home. Anyway, so I sort of sped the thing up and I was like, oh, look, I'll have a look at it. And I looked at it and I basically, what I saw observing myself do this was that I tried to draw Akuma, and after about 10 minutes of me drawing him wrong, I then started to figure out how to draw him properly, and that was it. And I didn't see the struggle that I felt, right? So the internal and the external struggle were different. And again, that sort of made me, because I'd always been someone who, like, I always have struggled mentally with this stuff, right? It's always been very challenging to me. And it's really until I saw this that I kind of was like, I just was not seeing the internal struggle play out on the page. I just saw me kind of try and do it a bit. And that really changed my whole approach to everything. Because firstly, I just sort of was thinking like, but maybe the struggle is inherently important to art, right? Like maybe you need this struggle to motivate yourself to get better, right? Maybe if it's too easy, it's not good. And that was my fear. And so I just was like, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's all just in my head. And maybe if I just had relaxed in that moment when I was like, oh, well, yeah, I don't know how to draw a Kuma. That's cool. Let's just keep going. That's fine. I was like, do I need to stress out? What will happen? And what I've sort of found out through doing this and recording myself a lot and putting myself under these sort of pressure sort of situations and also just paying attention to how I feel is I really think, no, you don't need the stress. I think often what you need to do is just trust the process and realize that these bad drawings, or when, I would go to draw the face and I'm like, oh, that doesn't look like him. It's like all that was happening is I was just trying to draw his face. I tried like maybe 4 or 5 times. I changed a bunch of lines. So maybe there's like 10 attempts of me erasing and scrabbling around. And after that, I kind of figured it out. Look, it's still not the best drawing, right, of a Kuma I'm sort of looking at now. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of okay. But anyway, the point is, all that was happening is my brain was just learning how to draw a Kuma based on the reference, and it took me a while. It took practice for me to get all those things to fire up and figure out what bits of him were kind of really working. And I sort of figured it out, like, oh, it's kind of like his hands are kind of cat-like. He's got the Capcom sort of like, hand poses, and like his face is a little bit cat-like, like his nose, the bridge of his nose is a little bit cat-like. And I kind of played these things up and, I kind of like figured it out. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And again, this wasn't designed as like the ultimate guide to draw a Kuma and fan art or whatever. Like, it's just a drawing exercise where I was like, hey, let's just try this. This is a good way to sort of get the ball rolling and get some drawing and just check, like, how good am I at drawing? How it's references in front of me, how good am I at doing this? But that really taught me a lot, right? And I really think that's so important as a lesson. And hopefully I can share that with you so you don't have to spend, a decade of your life stressing out about drawings when you don't need to. Because I really think you don't need to. I think you just need to keep trying to make the drawing better. And what's happening is your subconscious mind is just learning how to draw the thing, learning how to draw a Kuma, what works, what doesn't. And again, you can internalize it, verbalize it a little bit. But a lot of what's happening is it's just practice, okay? Because I knew how to draw anatomy. I knew how to draw the figure. I knew how to draw the pose. Like, everything was there. I just needed to connect up the visual library side of it with the rest. And it just took a while. But it felt like, it was the end of the world. So again, expectation is everything, right? Intent is everything. And just understanding what you're going to do. And if you do bad drawings, again, all that's happening is with bad drawings is you're just learning how to draw it properly. You're just trying it and it's not working. And you're just discarding that as a solution and trying to find for another one, right? So it may feel like you're kind of scrabbling around and you're like sucking, but in many cases, that's just you getting better. That's what it feels like. And if you don't freak out about that, then it actually won't feel as bad, right? Again, let me know if you got comments or questions about that as well, because I know that's like, that's easy. That's easy to say, right? It's hard to implement. It's a mind game, right? So, and there's a couple of extra things here, right, that we can sort of talk about like what we can do to improve these sort of different elements. But the main thing to think about, I think, is like the fact that we also use process to get from A to B, right? That's a major part of the sort of, the drawing, right? How do we get from A to B? It's not these elements are sort of there, but when talking about bigger images, we use process, right? And the real key here that I think is important to understand, if I can get the next slide to go, there we go, is that the more steps we place along the way, the more places we can feel free to make bad drawings and learn, right, while still creating a finished image. Okay, so that's a big part of what I teach. This is the reason, like, the illustration course is so much about process, and I think process is important, is because having a process where you have more overlapping steps gives you more freedom to learn and create good imagery at the same time, right? Because a big part of the expectation, right, if you're thinking about going back to the drawing Akuma thing, is like, if I maybe didn't know my anatomy at the same time as I was, trying to do that, I would have a much bigger problem. It's like I'm fighting different battles on different fronts, and that can be very overwhelming, right? So it's very important to have areas where you can deal with different elements of those problems, right? Like the visual library, the drawing, all of those things. You need to have sort of different places in your process where you can really focus on one thing. And the more of those you have, the more you break down the process, the more opportunity you have to directly affect one problem at a time, right? Break them down. It's divide and conquer, right? It's a fundamental principle of combating challenge or overwhelm, right? Because the major thing that's happening here is we're getting overwhelmed by the complexity of the task, right? The task is so complex. There's so many moving parts. There's so many ways it can go wrong. We really need to chunk this down, divide and conquer, so that we can focus on one thing at a time. And that's why a process is so important, because it allows us to actually have a go at doing this. So again, you can kind of see here, this is like showing you the process for the sort of one of the images that I've sort of like created, right? And again, this was like the thumbnail. This is the idea. And again, the idea of doing a thumbnail is where we sort of break down and start to understand like, the story and the narrative and the composition, right? We sort of handle those things at that sort of time. But the thing is, the more you get used to a process as well, the more certainty you feel in your direction. And that's why, again, it's kind of, I can show you my process and you are more than welcome to use exactly the process I use. You probably will find that you want to develop your own that's very specific to you, or that, again, I can hopefully help you through the things I'm saying to figure out how to use someone else's process that is closer to the type of art that you want to create, if mine is not. But the key here is that what we're after is more certainty in the process and more certainty in the overall direction, so that you can start to experiment and play within the process and improve, again, those things like the visual library, all of your shading and rendering and perspective. Once you kind of have the process down, you realize where those different elements fit within the process, and you can sort of start to actually build on them and use the process of creating a finished image to learn, right? It's not just sort of an outcome, it is actually a learning device. This is if you have a process and if you keep working at it. One of the benefits of that is that, again, you can utilize that to learn then, as opposed to kind of always being in the dark, right? So again, the second step of this is where we think more about structure, sort of detail, and my basic process for line and color is thumbnail, construction drawing, and this is the construction drawing. And you can obviously break your construction drawing up into more sort of basic pieces. One where maybe you just focus on big shapes, the overall perspective, and then one where you sort of just focus on characters and details, right? One where maybe you just focus on texture, et cetera, right? You can keep chunking this down mentally, but for me, the line and color process has, 4 basic steps. It's thumbnail, construction drawing, finish lines, and then color. And this is, again, it's the construction drawing phase, right? And again, as I said, the key here is the more certainty you feel within your process, the more you spend within a process, the more advantage you're going to find in feeling more relaxed and sort of having a better understanding of what's likely to happen. So it's not, and this is why, again, I feel like it's so important not to sort of bounce around too much, right? Not to bounce around too much and sort of say, I'm going to try this process and that process. The advantage of you having a very distinct process that's just yours is that you can then start to experiment more, right? And I think often what people are looking for when they pick different processes is like, they're kind of after something new. They're trying to like get something different. And I think often you really just have to stick with one thing and figure out where it takes you, right? The power of having a process that's yours is that you can then leverage that and you feel more certainty. You're like, oh, no, I kind of been here before. I know what I need to do here, right? I just need to, this would be a good opportunity in the construction drawing phase to, just crack out the anatomy books, make sure that, the anatomy in this is perfect. Or like, next time you're like, oh, look, last time I tried the perspective and the perspective wasn't 100%. So let's just, as before I even start my construction drawing, let's put in all the lines, get it all solid. Whatever it is, right? But you have certainty that like, even though you may be learning something new there and you have discomfort at that point and uncertainty there, that the rest of it is kind of taken care of, right? You know where you're going. And I feel like that feeling of knowing where you're going is so vital to the creative process. It's the same when you take on a larger project, right? If you think about the idea of taking on, a massive project as a creative, right? Maybe you're making, again, the things I've done is like make board games where I've done all the art for a board game, all of the marketing, all the visual stuff for a board game or card game. And I've created these comic books, which, where you're working on one thing for multiple years. The first time you do that, there is so much uncertainty about how this thing is going to turn out that it's almost overwhelming, right? But once I do it once, you kind of know, like, oh yeah, there is just the bit in the middle of any big project where you basically, it's sort of called the trough of despair in the middle of a big project where all of the enthusiasm that you had to begin with is kind of worn off. You just realize you're just sort of trudging through the middle of it. You can't really make a lot of creative choices or changes because you've kind of done most of it and you just have to keep going, but you can't see the end, right? It's a part of every big process, right? And if you've been through it before, you kind of just know like, hey, look, this really sucks right now, but I've just got to keep going through. You just got to keep like walking through the blizzard of despair. And anyone who's tried one of these big projects will be able to relate and maybe, hopefully, if you ever do that, that will sort of help you. But yeah, once you've been there, you kind of, next time you're there, you're like, oh yeah, I get this. It's just kind of keep working, keep going. And eventually you see the light at the end of the tunnel. You kind of feel like, oh, I'm actually going to be able to do this. This is actually going to end one day, But, often you're there for a year, 6 months. Like, oh man, I just got to draw this, like these 50 pages, these hundreds of pages of book. And it's the same thing again and again and again. Is this ever going to end? Is this going to be good? Is this going to be worth it? All these things come up, right? And it's the same with an artistic process. In the middle, I think often people lose focus. They lose faith in the process. And having that process will help you, right? Have gone through that process and developing it will help you a lot. But most people kind of get lost in the middle. And the process, again, is just what you use to not get lost. So again, next stage here would be, again, the finished lines, right? And this is where, again, I sort of focus on quality of line, making it look sort of as fancy as possible, executing on all of that sort of structure, really thinking about, those subtle little details. And again, here, because I've spent a lot of time, practicing a process where I have lines and painted stuff, I'm able to do this weird stuff where, again, half of the background is going to be painted. Some of it's going to have lines in the background. Anyway, but I kind of know, I'm like, no, I know where this is going, right? And if you practice your process a lot, you know where you're going to. But the key here is not just like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But the more relaxed you are overall, the less stressed you are, and the more you can actually get into flow. And the more flow you can get into, the more creative you can be. So it's not just like, oh, yeah, you need to do this to reduce stress. It's like, well, stress is what stops you going into flow, and not going into flow is what sort of stops you being creative and actually doing good work, right? Being in flow and being out of your sort of intellectual editing mind is really what allows you to create good art, I think, right? I think it's so important. And you actually can't do that until you have a process that sort of is comfortable enough where you can just kind of go with it, right? And you sort of know where you're going. It's that classic thing where, if you drive, that classic thing they say where, eventually, if you just drive the same way to work again and again and again, you can kind of drive there and then you sort of forget how you got there, right? Your brain is just sort of taking over automatically. You're in flow, right? It's the sports analogy, right? Sometimes you're just in the zone and you're kind of not really even aware of what you're doing, but you're doing good stuff, right? And you can't access that part of yourself consciously. It needs to be something where we are relaxed, because flow occurs in the brainwave zone, the frequency that is just between consciousness and unconsciousness. So it only happens when if you think about it, flow happens when we're so relaxed, or certainly it is the same brainwave frequency, right? We don't often access flow by getting super relaxed, but if you analyze where it exists in the alertness spectrum of the brain, flow occurs when you're sort of very relaxed and it's like you're just dipping into unconsciousness, right? If you think about you're going to sleep or you're just sitting there on the couch, super relaxed, everything's kind of like disappearing, right? The world is kind of disappearing. That's where flow is. That's where it happens. And what happens is we just kind of stay in that state in flow, and it's just before your body sort of goes to sleep, just before consciousness disappears. You're basically existing in that conscious, unconscious mind frequency, and that's where flow is. So you kind of need to be relaxed to access a state of flow, and that's why I feel like often if you don't actually have a good process and you haven't really worked it out, you're actually not able to access the creativity that comes with being relaxed as you're creating, right? So it's like you're never really even actually going to be able to create anything where, you're sort of surprising yourself or doing those sort of things until you have a process, right? That's when the magic actually starts to happen. So again, this is sort of the finished result of that image, and just sort of shows again how we go from sort of one thing to another thing. But the idea there, right, the next thing is that when you're actually in flow, right, and when you're sort of doing this, it really makes us focus on real problems, not imagined ones, right? And that's sort of what I was talking about before with that Akuma image, right, where there are real problems in the image, which is like, I don't know how to draw Akuma, and I probably need like 10 minutes to figure it out, and probably I should have done that before I do a demo. But again, I like to do all this stuff. Everything I do is one take. I don't prepare anything. There's nothing where I'm sort of like, oh, and here's one I prepared earlier. I just do not do that. Nothing could be more boring for me, right? Everything I do, all the demos I'm doing, if I can in any way, it's all new stuff, right? Because I want people to see me struggle, right? Because it's not real. I'm not really showing the process if it's something that's pre-baked. But the real problem there is not me sort of worrying about like being in my conscious mind, being like, oh man, maybe everyone who's going to take my course is going to think I'm a fake or a failure, or, maybe this isn't a good idea because I'd already signed up to do the course, right? I'm teaching it. I've just got to make this video, right? Because it starts, in a few weeks. And I'm like, oh no, right? All that nonsense that's just stopping me from the real problem, which is like, dude, you just need to learn how to draw Akuma. It's going to take you 5 minutes, 10 minutes tops. Just chill out, do it, right? That's the real problem. The imagined problem is all this existential dread of like, oh, if I don't figure out how to draw this nose here, maybe, maybe it's going to be the end of the world. Maybe I'll have to get a real job. Maybe I'll have to be an accountant. Maybe my mother was right. This isn't the best career for me. Maybe I won't be able to draw. That means I won't be able to do what I want. And I'm going to, maybe I'll just be unhappy for the rest of my life. Like all this stuff flashes ahead, and all it is like, just learn how to draw the nose. Just relax. It's all good, So the key there is just, just the more you can get to a point where you're relaxed with it, the better, right? And I really think process and just doing the thing that you want to do and practicing that and getting good at that gets you into flow. And it trains you to sit down at your drawing environment and create, right? And once you sort of get more used to being in flow, being in a comfortable sort of zone when you sit down, the more you will key yourself into that, right? That's so important, right? Your environment, your drawing space, being in the right mindset, right? If you practice and you spend a lot of time drawing stuff that you enjoy, that you're good at, where you're sort of practicing the process, going through the motion, then once you start to fold in little discomfort things, it's like your brain is used to being in flow as you sit down. It's used to being in flow as you go through this process. And these problems don't sort of tend to trigger those sort of negative emotional outbursts, let's say, right? The doubt, right? Because doubt doesn't exist in flow, right? It's just your subconscious mind is like, let's just shoot, let's get this ball through this hoop, right? Let's, whatever it is, whatever sport you're doing, it's like, let's just do this. There's nothing in the way. There's none of this like neocortex saying, but what about this? What if my mother was right? What if I'm never going to be able to draw the things I want to do? Like, that does not exist in flow, right? That doesn't exist. That's when people are just doing stuff and doing it well. And again, that's the goal. That's what we want to train for. That's where we want to spend most of our time. So a big function of that is the process, right? And I keep saying this because it's so important. It's not just sort of, you can pick this process or that process. It's no, if you pick a process and you get better and better at doing it, that will solve a lot of other problems. It's not just the image that you're working on and you working in a particular style that it solves. It solves a lot of problems. And it facilitates a lot of learning, right? Not just, again, about being in the process, but it trains you to be sitting down and being in flow and being relaxed as you create. And you're sitting there, you're in Photoshop or you're on a page or whatever. It's training you to be in that good mindset, right? And that's so important, right? Because again, I think this is at the key of everything, right? We are what we repeatedly do, right? Again, Miyamoto Musashi, the Book of Five Rings, you can only fight the way you practice. You can't sort of, create this amazing art if you don't practice creating amazing art and using the process that you want to do to get there. It's very tricky to like do studies or do things that are easy here and there and slowly build it up. You often have to just sort of attack this problem head on and just get acclimated to the scenario and learn how to be in that flow, be in that sort of area. I think that's so, so important, right? Again, this is where I maybe deviate from a lot of other people when they sort of teach these things, because I'm all about like, look, just do it, right? And understand like, yeah, it's hard. These things come up, right? We're challenged, right? That's the whole point. Drawing is challenging. It's a lifelong challenge, right? We can always get better at it. That's what's so fun about it though, right? That's what's so awesome about this career, about this hobby, about whatever it means to you, is that you can always improve. You can always be thinking about it, right? That's what's so good. That's why I think it's really good to just think about the process and, again, these 5 things that are really sort of at the core of what might go wrong. And if stuff is going wrong, the trick is you can step back and analyze it if you need. And that's really the only point that your neocortex and your conscious mind is going to become valuable, is if you sort of step back and say, which of these things is going wrong right now? How can I facilitate that? But a lot of this learning, I think, happens more by magic, right? It happens by you just being in flow, learning, sublimating a lot of this stuff, integrating it into muscle memory, instinct, and a lot of this stuff happens, right? A lot of what separates a really good artist from just the beginners is the good artist they'll be doing something, and the best way to explain it is your spidey sense goes off, and you're like, no, I think I need to change it. I think that this needs to be different, right? Because you just have a feeling that like, that's going to end badly, or this could look better if it's over here. We're not often listening to big conscious things, right? We're often listening to these subconscious, subtle memories, right? This stuff that I think is much closer to sort of magic and intuition than it is to sort of like rules and big sort of intellectual things and being able to sort of talk about it, right? That's what you need to do, right? Is to get into that space, get into flow, practice sitting down, creating stuff you want, and just building that muscle, build that creative loop. So anyway, that's all I have to say about this. Hopefully this has been interesting. I can talk about this stuff all day. Let me know if you got any questions or comments or things you'd like clarified. But other than that, happy drawing. Hopefully you find a process that works for you. And if you don't, just remember, it's important to stick with it anyway, right? Because there's value in just finding a process that works, right? That would be very valuable. But hopefully you can find that. Hopefully you can learn to spend as much time as possible in flow with a positive relationship to art. I think that's where the magic starts to happen. So good luck with it. We'll catch you around.